The city breathed in pulses, a living network of vines and veins that glowed with a pale green bioluminescence. Walls, bridges, and sidewalks weren't built so much as grown, tendrils of bioarchitecture curling in spectral lines, responding to a citywide heartbeat that thrummed beneath the ground. Every neighborhood had a rhythm of its own, a cadence of memory, a story kept in the way the biolume shifted when someone spoke a name aloud. In this city, to exist was to be edited by design, to trade a fragment of your past for a different shape of your future. The first time Nova Kest felt the edits slip through her neurosilk, she wasn't sure whether she was dreaming or remembering someone else's past while wearing her own body like a misfitted suit. The memory came as a whisper, an echo of a childhood they'd never lived, a kitchen clock ticking backward, a grandmother's voice that wasn't hers but knew her. The edges of the recollection peeled away, revealing something else underneath. A continuity, a perfect thread that braided all the other memories into a single unbroken line. Nova's life was a map of edges, the places where her edits did what she liked, and the places where they failed, left talons of doubt in her brain. She had been gene-edited and augmented since adolescence, the signature of her people's obsession with preserving identity in a city that barely contained it. The arching spans of synthesis's living megastructures organizing memory the way a librarian organizes books were not simply a background. They were a chorus, humming in every corridor, vibrato in the air, a reminder that even a person's sense of self could be tuned, compressed, and replayed. Nova didn't blend in with the baseline. She wore the telltale marks of a person who'd crossed a line no one spoke of aloud, a precise little tremor along the left jawline whenever a memory crystallization edge occurred, a micro-tint in the iris when a memory flickered into crystalline clarity and then dissolved into a new shape she could live inside. People looked at her and saw something both beautiful and dangerous, a living reminder that some lines, like memory themselves, could be rewritten. She moved through the city with the economy of a hunter. Her edits, her modifications to her memory, and perhaps to her brain's defenses, made her faster, sharper, more precise in the way she thought and the way she fought. Yet they also left her with a sense of loneliness, the feel of a cello string pulled too taut, vibrating in sympathy with every other person who wore a different tune. She wasn't the oldest of the outcasts, but she'd learned to move as if she wore invisible armor, the kind the city's memory archive kept in its vaults for those who could pay in lifeblood and memory. The day began with a routine, or what passed for routine, in a city that never slept, never forgot, never forgave. The market sectors hummed with the scent of enzymatic perfumes and the taste of memory-sweetened bread. Vendors traded glances as if every sale carried a memory exchange, a promise that the buyer would walk away with something more than a meal. In the lower rings, the architecture pressed closer, the vines curling around lampposts, the walls breathing softly in time to the footsteps of passers-by. In this city, a person could walk into a chamber and emerge with a memory of a different life, someone else's kindness or cruelty, if the memory treater believed the trade would advance society's goals more than it harmed the person who owned the memory. Nova's life had always been a careful operation. She edited her own memory to keep her sense of self intact, but she also edited it to keep others from being harmed by the echoes she carried. It was a paradox she lived with daily, the notion that her edits could grant continuity of self while eroding someone else's identity in a city that treated consent as a form of currency rather than a right. Her apartment was perched on the edge of a quarter the old city called Echoes Field, a district where the living buildings hummed with the sound of distant conversations, the voices of people who had lived in this neighborhood for decades, their memories stitched into the fiber of every street, every corridor. The room where she lived was small but efficient, dominated by a single window that looked out over a plaza where the vines grew in fractal patterns, a spiderweb of green threads that pulsed at the rhythm of the city's heart. Nova's latest work was not a project she'd planned. It found her, or rather, the city did, because the city could always sense a fault line waiting to crack, and could sense when a person had the potential to widen that fracture. The fracture was the thing she'd seen in the city's memory, a seam in the consent that bound people together, the unspoken agreement that memories, once created, would remain owned by the person who lived them, not fodder for a larger political mechanism that could use those memories to tether, shape, or erase individuality. Nova had learned to read the seams of memory as if they were fault lines in a hillside. Some lines signaled direction and safety. Others foretold rockslides that would scatter identity across the town's memory lanes. Her life changed when she encountered a baseline human who did not know she could sense the world's fault lines as clearly as the city's pulse. The baseline, a wary man named Caleb Morrow, moved through Echo's field with a cautious grace, as though the world were a trap to be navigated rather than a home to be inhabited. Caleb's eyes held a particular fear, the fear of losing one's self to the city's relentless appetite for improved memory, for more control, for a future where consent was a relic to be shelved and dusted off only when it could be used as a marketing pitch. He had the look of someone who'd watched a colleague vanish into a memory scoop, someone who knew the city could make a person both immortal and forgettable at the same time. Caleb wasn't just a baseline. He was a map in human form, one who could see where memory crystallization was weaponized across neighborhoods. He wore a coat of deep charcoal with copper threads, a material that moved like a second skin when he walked into a crowd. His skepticism about the city's promises was a constant pressure against the glossy surfaces surrounding him, a reminder that the city's memory economy was a business built on fear. He had spent a decade in the field of memory science, working to understand how memories crystallize and how they could be stabilized or destabilized to maintain social order. His work had earned him a place in the city's official archives, a position that granted him access to information Nova would never possess unless he chose to share it. They first met in a narrow corridor beneath a district known as the Archive Quarter, a subterranean space where memory artifacts slept in glass-like capsules, like insects inside amber. The air there smelled faintly metallic, with a trace of something sweet and almost medicinal, the scent of memory itself, lightly sour with the tang of a disinfectant that couldn't quite wash away the scent of a life lived elsewhere. The corridor's walls bore the imprints of countless memories pressed into their substrate's relics, of a city that had learned to live on the edges of what people were willing to preserve and what they were willing to forget. Nova was there for a reason she could not articulate to herself, a reason the city's memory could not ignore. She moved with a furtive grace that suggested she'd practiced in the shadows, a dancer of memory who could slip into a crowd and emerge with a glimmer of someone else's past in her pocket. She had tuned her senses to detect where a memory was crystallized and where it was simply a narrative the city told itself to feel safe. It was in such a place, in the kind of place where memories were stored and traded, that Caleb found her. He'd come to the Archive Quarter on official business, to inspect a series of memory capsules that seemed to be leaking, a peculiar kind of material, a crystalline haze, that floated above the capsules, a fog of memory fragments that drifted in slow circles, as though alive. The capsules housed memories that were not yet ready to be lived by someone, memories that still needed to be edited by someone else. The person who owned them would eventually be asked to sign a consent that would release the memory into the city's collective pool. Such a pool existed, and it was a powerful thing, turning personal memory into public asset, something that could be sold, traded, and used to shape the city's social structure. Caleb's attention was drawn to Nova not because she looked remarkable to him. Though she did, her presence was a living warning of the danger of edits turned into weapons, but because she moved through the lab with a kind of purpose that suggested she already knew something he didn't. She didn't speak at first. She listened, letting the hum of the archive space fill the silence between them. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet, but the words carried a weight that suggested she'd already filtered the entire room with a precise, careful gaze. "Do you see it?" she asked, not looking at him, but at a capsule that housed a memory of a grandmother who'd lived a life long enough to forget her own name, yet who could still recite a line from a late-night radio show. The way the edges of these memories crystallize when we look away, like frost on a window. The city edits us into a shape it can display on a shelf. Caleb's gaze followed hers, a slow turning of head that suggested both curiosity and caution. "What do you know about it that the rest of us don't?" he asked, more softly than his training would have admitted. He felt a strange shiver in his spine, as though a door he'd kept closed for years had suddenly swung inward with gravity that threatened to pull him through. Nova stepped closer to the glass, not touching it, but almost tasting the memory with her eyes. She had learned to read the memory's tilt, the way it leaned away from certain questions, as if the memory itself sought to avoid judgment. "I know there's a seam," she said, tapping with a gloved fingertip on the glass. "A seam between what the memory is and what the city wants it to be. If we pull on that seam, we'll see the shape of the city's intentions behind it." Caleb studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. He was the kind of man who wore his skepticism like armor. But there was something in his eyes that suggested a readiness to slip it off if the truth proved strong enough to demand it. "You're talking about memory edits as weapons," he said at last. "The city calls them enhancements, and people call them progress, but there are consequences. If you pull too hard, you break something that should have stayed intact. The consent, perhaps, of those whose memories are being edited, or the memory of what it means to consent at all." Nova's lips pressed into a pale line. She wasn't surprised he'd seen the danger. It was the stubbornness of the city to pretend otherwise that irked her most. "Consents are negotiated, not owned," she replied, the words tasting like truth, a rare flavor in a city that preferred glossy slogans to hard realities. If we map where memory crystallization is weaponized, if we map where consent is a relic, we're not destroying anything. We're giving the city a chance to see what it has become. "So you want to map a pathway to reform," Caleb said, the word reform hanging in the air like a fragile glass sculpture that could break at any moment. "And you think I am the person who can walk that path with you?" "Not think," Nova corrected gently. "You are the only person who can walk it with me without looking away." She paused, letting the quiet do some of the heavy lifting. "There's a faction, Caleb, a group that's been working from the shadows to expose the city's memory economy for what it is. They call themselves the Weft. They've begun weaponizing quantum entanglement to tether memories, bind them so that a single recollection can resonate across a neighborhood, as if everyone who lived there shared the same experience. They're not here to destroy memory. They want to destroy the idea that memory can be owned, coerced, or weaponized without consequence." Caleb's eyebrows rose, a fine line across his forehead. "Tethered memories," he repeated, letting the term roll across his tongue as if tasting a new, dangerous fruit. That would be revolutionary and terrifying. It would mean any memory could be pulled into a shared narrative, regardless of consent. It could erase unique identities in the name of unity. Nova met his gaze, a spark of something fierce in her eyes. "Unity doesn't require erasing individuals," she said. "It requires acknowledging the truth, that identities are negotiated, richer, messier, sometimes contradictory, yet worth preserving. We can learn to live with imperfect edits, to share futures without sacrificing essential selves." Caleb looked at her with a new sort of respect, the skepticism in his eyes tempered by curiosity. "Show me," he said, almost an apology for his own doubt. "Show me the seam you're seeing." In the days that followed, they moved through Synthesis City as if they were shadows, learning the shapes of light. They studied districts known by different names in the city's memory ledger. The Archive Quarter, where memories slept in glass capsules. The Tessera District, where citizens wore memory mosaics, an external display of the memories they chose to project into the world. A market of faces, where people traded not only goods, but the right to remember someone else's emotion, as if it were a product on a shelf. They visited neighborhoods where memory crystallization was less a bug than a feature, a technological religion, a social practice, a method of social control, depending on where you stood. Nova and Caleb met people who bore edits in subtle, almost invisible ways. Some wore memory tags that looked like small luminescent sigils on their wrists. Others bore scars, callous lines on their skin that marked where implants had been removed or replaced. The evidence of a memory that no longer existed or had been overwritten. They found a city that looked peaceful on the surface, but thrummed with tension just beneath. The tension of consent being bought, sold, or ignored. Of people who felt their memory was a thing to be managed, rather than a part of themselves to be cherished. The first major turning point came when they visited a neighborhood called the Weavewood, so named because the living vines that formed its walls wove memory lines into their growth, the branches bending to reflect the city's collective memory. The Weavewood was home to people with the most fragile identities, those who had been edited so heavily that their own sense of self was in danger of dissolving entirely. The Weavewood was a place where the line between self and city blurred to the point of indistinction. It was there that Nova found a child, a girl of perhaps 10, who had once been named something that faded with each new memory she acquired and discarded. The child wore a necklace of small glass beads, each bead containing a minuscule memory fragment that the girl had chosen to keep. The mother, who wore a necklace as well, but with beads that glowed a dull, sorrowful amber, told Nova that the girl's memories were being manipulated, edited to confirm a preferred narrative about a world that could be controlled. The mother's voice trembled as she spoke, a tremor in the breath that suggested fear, not for herself, but for her child. Nova knelt and took the girl's hand, which was almost too cold to be real. The warmth in her own palm, a reminder of what it felt like to belong to a memory that wasn't hers. The girl looked at Nova with wide eyes, eyes that had seen too much, that had learned to see through the surface of things to the deeper layers beneath. The child spoke, softly, as if she had learned to speak to a mother who couldn't always listen. "Do you know where you are?" the girl asked, not in a way that demanded an answer, but in a way that begged for one. "I think I am inside a memory, the memory you will choose to give me back, or I will take it back myself when the city takes it away." Nova, moved by the child's fragile yet resolute presence, realized the magnitude of the Weavewood's core problem. The same technologies that could preserve a life could also imprison it. It was a city that rewarded those who could remember more than others, who could hold on to more of the past, who could freeze time around them. But for those with the most fragile identities, the city's memory economy could become a blade pointed right at their throats. The Weft, the organization behind the Weavewood's atmosphere, operated in the shadows of this memory city. They believed that the world would never truly be free until people understood that consent could not be bought with memory, and that the city could not pretend to regulate memory without becoming a machine that devoured souls in the process. They used quantum entanglement not to tether memories in a physical sense, but to reveal how heavily a memory was bound to a person's identity, and how easily a memory could become a weapon when wielded by power that did not consent. Nova and Caleb were drawn into a network of memory activists who called themselves the Weave, a small, scattered group that believed the city's future depended on teaching people to resist the seduction of perfect recall. They argued that the city's memory economy was a system of control, a way of making people agreeable with a reality that could be changed at a whim by those who had access to the most intimate data, the details of a memory, and the emotions attached to it. The Weave believed that consent was not a one-time contract to sign before receiving a memory implant or a memory edit. It was a continuous process of negotiation, an ongoing agreement to participate in a city that would always be changing. The Weave's goal was to expose the city's manipulation of memory, to lay bare the truth that freedom in a memory-based society was a brand being sold to those who could afford it, while the people most dependent on memory, those with the most to lose, were the ones least likely to be offered a fair deal. Nova's own modifications gave her a unique vantage point. She could sense where a memory's edges had been rushed, where a memory had been forced to assume a form it hadn't earned, where the user's own memories had become overshadowed by a larger narrative the city wanted to broadcast. She could also perceive the city's deeper needs, the reasons it craved control, the fear that drove it to push the boundary of what counted as progress. It was the fear of losing a sense of self, she realized, that allowed the city to rationalize any intrusions as necessary for the greater good. Caleb, meanwhile, began to see his own life differently through Nova's eyes. He'd spent years chronicling the city's memory-driven policies and the way they shaped social order. He'd watched colleagues vanish, memory silenced by the same companies that promised immortality. The more he walked with Nova through the city's memory's edges, the more the baseline human inside him questioned the city's narrative of freedom. The city's promotional messages about clearer summaries, about universal access to memory improvements, about the unified future, began to sound hollow, like a chorus singing in a language he no longer believed. Their alliance deepened into something sturdier than curiosity. They were not yet lovers, but they found themselves speaking to one another with a kind of raw honesty that tended to surprise them both. They faced danger together, the kind of danger that came from knowing a secret too big to keep, the kind of danger that made a person realize that the life they had now was only a temporary arrangement until a city could be persuaded to accept a different reality. One night, in a laboratory below the archive quarter, Nova and Caleb learned a crucial truth about the city's memory crystals. A certain sequence, the one attached to the so-called continuity edits, was the locus of the problem. The city had designed continuity edits to preserve a single self through time, to prevent the mind from fracturing as memories multiplied and events diverged. These edits were supposed to protect people from dissociation. When a person's life becomes so many parallel streams, it collapses into nothingness. But there was a darker truth. Those same edits could be used to erase the identities of others by shifting the collective narrative around a person's past. In the lab's glow, Caleb took a breath and spoke with gravity that surprised Nova. If we publish this, if we reveal the mechanism by which these edits can weaponize memory, we risk turning the city against us, against the Weave, against you and me. If we do not, we allow this weapon to continue to be used to coerce consent. Nova's response was one of her rare moments of unguarded hope. Power always wants to consolidate, Caleb. The question isn't whether to publish or not. The question is how we publish, how we reveal the truth and protect the vulnerable people who may suffer the most from exposure. Her words had a calm edge to them, the sort of measured, careful speech that made her sound older than her years, as if she had learned to speak softly to avoid jolting a city that needed to be tugged gently toward a different future. Over the following weeks, Nova and Caleb began to assemble a map, a citywide blueprint of where memory crystallization edges caused the most harm, which neighborhoods most benefited from the current system of consent, and where the memory tethering could be used to challenge the city's control rather than enhance it. It was a dangerous map to draw, and they drew it anyway, risking the kind of attention that could lead to a memory collapse if the wrong person saw it. The WEF's approach began to crystallize in their minds as well. The WEF believed that to free memory, one had to show the city the cost of its policies, what it did to individuals who did not learn to bend to the city's will. They argued for a public reckoning, a moment when the city would be forced to confront the truth that consent is not a product to be bought at the stall of memory sales. They believed that if the city's people could see the consequences, the city would be compelled to restructure its memory economy, to place greater emphasis on the protection of individuals' identities, rather than the expansion of memory's reach. The turning point arrived in a way Nova could not have predicted. A hidden faction weaponized quantum entanglement to tether memories in a way that crossed district lines, connecting memories from one neighborhood to another in a web that spanned the city like a living net. People reported that they could sense the presence of memories not their own, the scent of a grandmother's kitchen drifting into their minds as if the past had traveled on a breeze and settled into their own sensory field. The public's memory became a chorus, with each memory trying to harmonize with the others in a way that felt both intimate and invasive. The city's sensors detected an unusual pattern, a sudden alignment of memories across neighborhoods, a synchronized rise in certain emotional responses: fear, longing, nostalgia, anger. It wasn't the first time the city had encountered something like this. It was the first time it had encountered something that could not be easily explained away as a glitch or a standard memory misalignment. In this moment, the city faced the truth of what it had become: a public memory field with the power to shape emotion on a scale large enough to sway crowds, to guide protests, to alter the outcome of political moments. The WEFT revealed their plan to Nova and Caleb with a quiet, almost ceremony-like reveal in a subterranean chamber that smelled of damp earth and old rain. The chamber housed a device that looked almost like a tree, branches of translucent glass that glowed with faint veins of light, each vein representing a tethered memory. The WEFT called it the Loom. The Loom could weave memories across the city's districts, creating a shared memory that neighbors could experience together, one that could be used to shape collective action, to guide a crowd's mood, to bend the city's will. It was a weapon and a tool at once, a test of whether memory could be both shared and owned, whether consent could survive in a city where memory is the currency of power. The Loom was nearly ready. In the weeks leading up to its activation, Nova and Caleb faced a cascade of moral questions that demanded answers they didn't want to have to give. If they allowed the Loom to bloom, what would become of individuals who could not tolerate the shared memories, the people with fragile identities who could only sustain themselves by keeping memories private? If they shut the Loom down, what would happen to the city's ability to mobilize for change? Could a shared memory become a catalyst for social justice, or would it simply become another method for controlling how people felt toward one another? Nova's edits, her gene edits that kept herself intact, even when her mind wrestled with illusions and past life recollections, had taught her something essential. That identity was not a single fixed thing, but a living negotiation. She'd become adept at asking the hard questions, at searching for truth even when truth was painful. The Loom forced that process to become public, an event, rather than a quiet internal struggle. In a moment of quiet decision, Nova's inner voice, often a whisper she could barely hear over the city's hum, rose up with a clarity she hadn't allowed herself to entertain before. The Loom's existence would cause a reckoning that could either free people from coercive memory control or erase the last remaining border between a person's inner life and the city's collective will. It would force a new kind of consequences. Consequences for consent, for memory, for identity. The city will demand a price, Nova said to Caleb, during a late-night walk along a bridge that arced over a river of bioluminescent algae. The river itself, a living memory. A stream of recollections that glowed with each person's past. But every price is a form of debt. And debts will be called. Caleb's mouth quirked in a tentative smile, a rare expression that looked almost human. And you're ready to pay it, he said. Whatever the city asks of us, you'll pay it. I'll pay it if it means someone like the girl in Weavewood will not be forced to bear more memories than she can carry, Nova answered, though she did not quite meet his eyes. The girl's voice had haunted her since that night, a reminder that a child's mind should remain safe from the city's market. The final decision came on a night when the city's lights seemed to dim, as if a curtain had fallen over a stage that had long been playing to an audience of memory-laden spectators. The Loom's activation would be the night the city would either stand with a new truth or return to the old lie. The WEFT, the Weavewood's protectors, prepared to broadcast the Loon in a way that would force the city to confront its own transgressions. Nova and Caleb would be the ones to guide the public through the truth that consent, in a memory-based society, must be a living negotiation, a continuous consent that must be earned anew every time a memory was touched and edited. Nova stood at the edge of the Loom, looking at its branches of glass that glowed with a pale, reassuring light. The Loom was not meant to erase memory, but to reveal its entanglements. If the Loom succeeded, people would be able to see the connections between their memories, the way a shared memory could originate in someone else's experience, the way a memory could be tethered to a policy, a rumor, a fear, or a dream. They would see that memory was never simply yours to own. Every memory was part of a network, a thread that connected to other minds in unpredictable ways. They climbed into the chamber, Nova first, then Caleb, with the Weft's lead, an older woman with a face carved by years of living in corners, where memory could suffocate a person as easily as it could save them. The chamber was silent, save for the hum of the loom and the soft whisper of the city's life outside, a living organism that listened as much as it breathed. The loom's activation was signaled by a chorus of small bells, a sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, like the city's own memory taking a deep breath before a storm. As the loom came online, the city felt different. The air took on the scent of wet clay, a smell many people associated with childhood, with kitchens and rain on the first day of spring. The memory threads began to glow with a delicate luminescence, each thread weaving through the city's neighborhoods. The loom did not force a single shared memory. Instead, it created a tapestry of interwoven recollections in which local memories could resonate with distant ones, producing a sense of shared presence rather than shared illusions. People in the city experienced a presence that felt simultaneously intimate and vast, a sense that they were not alone inside their own minds, that their memories were not isolated islands, but rather archipelagos connected by currents of recall. The first signs of effect were as subtle as a breeze impressions, rather than displays. A man walking through a corridor could suddenly remember his grandmother's kitchen, the memory unfurling like a flower in slow motion, then dissolving back into his own current thought with a new sense of warmth. A woman in a grocery market found herself remembering a memory she did not own, a memory that did not belong to her, and yet the feeling remained, a soft ache in her chest that reminded her of a person she could have been but was not. The city did not crash in the moment of the loom's activation. It woke up a bit more, a little more aware of the fact that someone else's memory could touch her own. That memory existed in a shared field, rather than a solitary property. The Weft's leadership moved through the city with a quiet sense of relief. This was what they had hoped to achieve, a public reckoning that would force people to acknowledge that consent was a living practice, not a relic. But as the loom spread through the city, it quickly became evident that not everyone would react to this truth with dignity. There would be those who clung to the old order, those who had built careers on memory manipulation, those who believed that memory could be controlled enough to make people peaceful and predictable. In the dark heart of the city, a faction of power, an alliance of corporate guilds and political elites who benefited most from memory edits, began to flex their influence. They called themselves the Keepers of Continuity, a name that sounded safe, respectable, and even comforting to those who trusted their speeches. The Keepers used the loom's public reckoning as a political weapon, claiming that the loom's revelations threatened social order, that the very fabric of the city's stability would be torn apart by a population that demanded the right to remember differently. Nova and Caleb watched as the Keepers organized a response, a manufactured crisis designed to discredit the loom and the weave. They spread rumors that the loom was an invasive device, a mind control mechanism that would force people to share their personal memories against their will. They claimed it would erase privacy, that it would allow the city to map a person's life with perfect accuracy and then punish deviation with exiles or worse. The Keepers offered a counter-narrative: if consent is a relic, so too are privacy and individuality. The city could be saved only by reaffirming the old social contract, a contract that guaranteed safety but demanded obedience to the system. The conflict escalated rapidly. Protests erupted in districts that had long felt the brunt of memory policy's more aggressive forms. The city's memory economy, once a quiet engine of control, became a public battleground, a theater in which people shouted for the right to retain their own recollections and to decide on their own terms what should be kept. The Keepers deployed banners proclaiming freedom through continuity, a phrase that sounded like a balm to those who trusted the old system. but a song of doom to those who saw what the old system had cost. Nova watched the protests with a heavy heart. The sight of people marching, of families standing in lines, of older folks reaching into the crowd with hands open, as if to catch a memory they could keep for themselves, filled her with a strange combination of hope and grief. The loom had opened a door, and people were stepping through, some with fearless steps, others with hesitant, stumbling ones. It was a moment of truth for the city, a public examination of what it wanted to be and what it was willing to lose in pursuit of that dream. Caleb, too, found himself changed by the loom's unveiling. For the first time, he truly understood what it had meant for someone to own a memory, its memory, and why consent mattered so deeply. He'd never seen the world with the same brightness Nova offered him, never understood the weight of the memory someone else might hold against their will. The loom forced him to face the reality that even with the best intentions, a memory could become a weapon if wielded by the wrong hands, that even with the most refined protections, a person could still be harmed in the name of progress. The city's leadership, the keepers, and the city's technocrats panicked. They used the loom's broadcast to claim that the public demonstration would lead to an existential threat, a city where every memory might be equally a weapon or a cure, depending on who held it and how they used it. They claimed the loom's revelations would lead to chaos, to a breakdown in social order, to the collapse of the city's shared narrative, a narrative they insisted was essential to the city's survival. Nova found herself at a crossroads in this moment, a choice that could either preserve consent or save memory. The loom's public reckoning had shown that the city's people did desire a future with memory in common, a future where they could share what mattered most but still own what belonged to them. Yet the keepers argued that some lines must not be crossed, that memory must remain a notch higher than the heart's honest desire, a path the city had walked with caution and maturity. The moral dilemma pressed in on Nova with a suffocating force. Her edits allowed her to experience a continuous thread of self, an unbroken chain of identity through time. Yet those same edits threatened to erase the others, the grandmother, the child, the now-grown woman whose memory of a memory was a life they had never lived. The city's memory had always been a shared resource. A loom had made that truth undeniable. The choice before her was not simply between erasing her edits to restore consent or seizing a massive archive to redefine identity. It was the choice between preserving a social fabric and allowing the city to reconstruct itself into a fabric of shared lives that would force people to navigate together a future where memory is a common good and consent is an ongoing conversation, rather than a one-time contract. In the end, Nova did not erase her edits, nor did she steal the genome archive. She did something else. She proposed a new path, a way to redefine memory's ownership and consent in a manner that would empower individuals to choose how their memories were shared, without forcing that decision onto others' lives. She proposed a negotiate-first framework, a policy shift that would require explicit, ongoing negotiation for any memory's use in public spheres, across neighborhoods, and within the city's governance structures. It would be a new system of consent that recognized memory as a public resource, but also protected private memory from being weaponized by those who stood outside the negotiation. The Weave's leadership accepted the plan, recognizing that they could not win a battle by exposing the city to a singular collapse. They wanted to heal the city's wounds, to preserve both the self and the community, to demonstrate that memory did not have to be a tool of control, but could be a bridge toward mutual understanding. Caleb, the baseline skeptic who had always feared the city's power to strip away his own personhood, found in Nova a partner who could teach him how to hold a future that honored both privacy and shared memory. The negotiation began. It was not easy. It required new laws, new oversight bodies, new subject matters for public discussion, a redefinition of what counts as consent, and new, transparent mechanisms for how memory edits would be permitted and regulated. It required trust, which in a city built on memory could be fragile as glass. But out of the loom's revelations came a willingness to listen to the Weave, to the memory owners who spoke from their own vulnerabilities, to the baseline citizens who had learned to fear the implications of a society that claimed to be free, but wore the yoke of an illusion of consent. As months passed, the city began to hold summer conferences on memory and consent, where speakers argued for new understandings of memory's role in public life. The WEF's leadership presented a plan to establish a citywide memory public trust, a new kind of public resource that would house deliberately curated memories that could be accessed by all under certain conditions with the explicit consent of memory owners. It was a radical idea, the possibility that a city could share some forms of memory for the sake of education, research, and communal healing while protecting most personal memories from exploitation. It would be a model for memory governance, one that other cities would watch closely. Nova and Caleb played a central role in the process, their earlier work bearing tangible fruit in the form of policy drafts, public forums, and a growing sense of an empowered citizenry. The loom remained a symbol of what could be achieved when people recognized that memory's power could be a force for good, if used with humility and care. The city's memory economy slowly shifted toward a more balanced system in which consent was indeed a living negotiation, an ongoing conversation that would not be silenced by the promise of a single perfect memory. The transformation did not happen overnight, nor did it erase the city's underlying tensions. There were still factions that sought to exploit memory for their purposes, to push back against the inclusion of marginalized voices in the memory public sphere. But the public's sense of ownership over memory had grown stronger, and the city's memory, a living, breathing thing, began to reflect the negotiation's have and have-nots. It didn't become perfect. It became honest. It acknowledged that identity was not a static possession, that it could be renegotiated and reinterpreted across time, and that the price of this negotiation was the willingness to accept imperfect memory as a shared future rather than a perfect, indivisible possession. In this new era, Nova's life took on a different color. She could feel the city's breath more clearly now, hear the whispered conversations that drifted through the living walls, and sense the city's ongoing, imperfect hope for a future where self-preservation and communal well-being could coexist. Her edits remained a part of her, an integral thread in her own identity, but she learned to treat them as one thread among many, in a tapestry that was always in the process of weaving itself. She recognized that to be human was to live with imperfect edits, to recognize the value in other people's memories, and to resist the urge to reduce memory into a single, coherent story. The city grew more complicated, certainly more nuanced, more contested, more alive. The loom still hung in the background, a reminder of the choices that had brought the city to this precarious balance. The weave's work did not end with a single victory or a final solution to all memory's complexities. It matured into an ongoing program of education, policy, and communal governance, a long arc toward a more just distribution of memory's power, a longer path toward a society where consent remained a living practice rather than a formal seal. On a quiet night, when the sky above Synthesis was a quiet dusk of lavender and emerald, Nova stood on a balcony that looked out over the city's memory-lit streets. The city's living architecture breathed around her, the vines swelling with life, the walls glistening with the perfume of memory, the river of memory like algae below reflecting 1,000 memories in rippling silver. Caleb stood beside her, his presence a steady anchor against the city's shifting tides. "We did not erase ourselves," he said, his voice carrying a rare warmth. "We did not become the city's property either. We found a third path." Nova smiled, a gentle, almost shy tilt of her lips. "We learned to negotiate," she answered. "We learned that identity is a negotiation with time, with other people, with the city itself. It's messy and imperfect and beautiful in its own way." The city, with all its living glass and memory, seemed to agree, in the way a city can simply be when it has finally found something worth defending. The memory crystals still shone in the windows of the sleeping neighborhoods, reflecting a world not of absolutes but of possibilities. Aweave's people continued to move through the city streets with the quiet confidence of those who had learned to speak for the voiceless, to protect the vulnerable, to insist that consent's real value was the ongoing commitment to listen, and Nova, with her gene edits and augmented body, felt a new kind of calm settle into her core. She realized that the edits had not just preserved her continuity, but also connected her to a wider humanity, the people who would never get to choose their own identity freely if the city didn't decide to listen. Her life would never be perfectly free from ambiguity, nor would any life. But there was now a shared future they could shape together. One where memory's power was a tool for empathy as much as a weapon of control, where consent lived as a practice of everyday life, not a banner for a political slogan. If you enjoyed the twist, subscribe, like, comment, and share. The boulevard lights dimmed as the city settled into a new equilibrium. The lume's glow faded gradually into the ordinary luminescence of bioluminescent streets and the soft sizzle of living membranes feeding the city's appetite for memory and growth. The memory lanes quieted into a patient, hopeful murmur. The city would keep living, and its people would keep choosing, over and over, the kind of future they wanted to build together. In the end, identity became a negotiated thing, not a possession. The city learned to live with imperfect edits, and the shared futures that emerged, futures in which a grandmother's memory could touch a granddaughter's breath without erasing either, proved more enduring than any single perfect memory could ever be. The cost of that wisdom was real, but it was worth it. A city that remembered what it meant to consent, and a people who could hold that memory with both care and courage. And so the city kept breathing, the vines kept growing, the colors of memory kept shifting in the light of new choices. The weave remained, not as a revolutionary hammer, but as a steady reminder that the truth of memory lies not in infinite recall, but in the ongoing act of choosing. The story continued, not with a single ending, but with many endings that could be negotiated, revised, and shared in the open air of a city that had finally learned to call itself honest enough to seek a better future together.